Thank you very much.
You bad chair.
Wait, we're on television, just for everyone's reminder. So welcome everyone today. We will be continuing our study on Bill C-69 and want to welcome our guests today. I'd like to introduce them. We have Meinhard Duhl, and he's here with the Schulich School of Law from Dalhousie University. Welcome. We have the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Brock Carlton, Chief Executive Officer, and Matt Gemmell, Acting Manager, Policy and Research. Thank you very much for being here. We have Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. We have Matt DeMille, Manager, Fish Wildlife Services, and Matt is, thank you, just trying to make sure I got everybody set. We have the Quebec Environmental Law Centre. We have Karine Peloffi, Managing Director, and right there. Thank you. My eyes are not the best. My apologies. Very nice to see you here today. And we have Tech Resources Limited, Sheila Risbud, Director, Government Affairs, and Mark Freeberg, Director, Permitting and Closure. Thank you very much for all of you being here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Try to help moving things along. At a minute, I put up the yellow card just to let you know you have a minute left, so you're nearing the end of your presentation. And then when it's the red card, it means that you've run out of time. Don't just stop in the middle of your sentence. Just finish up what you're saying, please, because we're out of time. All right, so you've got 10 minutes each, and then we'll move into questioning. We'll hear from all of you, and then we'll go to questions. So who would like to start? Mr. Duhl, go ahead.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to speak to you about the impact assessment portion of Bill C-69. To ensure efficient use of my time, I will read from a prepared statement. Very briefly, my background in EA goes back to work on SIA 1992 as a policy advisor to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. Since then, I've offered legal advice to proponents, panel members, and interveners involved in EA. I served as a panel member on the Lower Churchill Joint Review Panel, and I've designed and shared strategic assessments on tidal energy and aquaculture in Nova Scotia. Of course, I cannot cover the range of issues that arise from the proposed Impact Assessment Act in 10 minutes. Impact assessment legislation is by its nature complex, and Bill C-69 is no exception. In the interest of time, I therefore refer you to my written submission and to a number of blog posts I have published with colleagues, some before and some after the release of Bill C-69. I've recently added some specific proposals for amendments to my blog, and you will find a link in my written submission. In the meantime, in the time remaining, I'd like to highlight a few key issues and invite members of the committee to follow up during Q&A. When SIA was drafted in the 1990s, we had limited experience to draw on. As a result, it is not surprising that the original act was largely enabling, with broad discretion to make decisions about key aspects of the process, from scope of the project, scope of assessment, public engagement, process options, and the final project decision up to follow-up. We now have 25 years of experience with the legislative federal EA process to draw on, and we need to implement lessons from that experience in the new Act. So what have we learned? First, we have learned that broad discretion without direction in law over time leads to bad decisions. This is the case in spite of good intentions at the time legislation is passed, and is at least partly a reflection of the fact that the purpose of the assessment process is to push decision makers out of their comfort zone to look beyond the obvious short-term benefits of proposed projects to the full range of often less obvious longer-term impacts, benefits, risks, and uncertainties. This is hard, and the more discretion is built into the process, the greater the risk that the more obvious short-term benefits will win out over the long-term impacts. A second thing that we've learned is that we can now offer strong statutory and regulatory direction to those tasked with making key decisions in the assessment process to better guide those decisions. If we draw properly on the experience, we can establish an appropriate mix of statutory and regulatory criteria to properly guide the exercise of discretion while leaving appropriate discretion where it is needed. We also have to make good choices about when decisions should be made by ministers, when they should be made by cabinet, by the agency, and when by an independent tribunal or the courts. We need to build into the process opportunities for refining the statutory and particularly regulatory direction over time. An appeal process to a specialized tribunal tasked with reviewing key decisions throughout the assessment process could ensure the quality of those decisions. And such a tribunal, by the way, could also serve to recommend improvements to regulatory direction over time. Let me start with a general observation about Bill C-69. My overall reaction is that the bill actually generally provides the powers needed to implement a good assessment process, but too much of that power is left to the discretion of decision makers, discretion without adequate direction. What Bill C-69 needs is a general rethink away from merely empowering decision makers to instead properly directing decision makers towards an effective, efficient, and fair process and a good outcome. We need the process to demonstrably and adequately inform decisions, not justify decisions already made. To achieve this, broad criteria for decision making should be set out in the statute itself. Sections 22 and 63 are a step in the right direction in this regard, but they need to be strengthened in two ways, in particular by replacing considering with based on and by requiring them to be refined through regulations. So the criteria need to be refined through regulations. Similar statutory criteria are warranted in other areas, such as triggering key process decisions and follow-up. Beyond those broad criteria that should be in the statute, there need to be more detailed principles, criteria, and guidance set out in regulations that will require adjustment over time, which is why they should be in regulations. Such criteria should be mandated in the statute, but set out in regulations. This guarantees that we will have the benefit of criteria while allowing the flexibility regulations provide in making adjustment over time. Key steps in the assessment process that are largely discretionary that need this kind of direction include the following. When federal project, strategic, or regional assessments are to be carried out, determining the scope of the project or proposal to be assessed, determining the scope of the assessment, process decisions, project decisions, and follow-up decisions. To be very clear, it is not enough to have the power to pass regulations in these areas. These regulations must be required in the statute. My plea to you during the clause-by-clause review is to do three things. Number one, identify these discretionary provisions throughout the bill and add general statutory criteria where possible. Number two, include clear language wherever there is discretion in the statute to require the discretion to be exercised in line with direction to be set out in regulations. And number three, include mandatory language, I would suggest in section 112, to develop regulations to guide the exercise of discretion in each of these areas. Finally, in the time remaining, let me briefly highlight three of the more specific topics I addressed in my written submission. First, on panel reviews. I think when we design the panel review process under this new act, we have to keep in mind that this is the highest level of assessment and is preserved for major projects. Projects assessed by panel reviews tend to involve billions of dollars in investments, and Canadians will be stuck with the consequences of the outcomes for decades. And I'd be happy to talk about the Lower Churchill assessment as an example of that. Whatever compromises we make to other process options, we cannot compromise on the quality of the assessment for panel reviews. I would suggest 5 specific things in that regard. Number one, we should replace the generic 600-day timeline with a requirement to set project-specific timelines at the conclusion of the planning phase. In some cases, that may be shorter. In other cases, it may be longer. We need to ensure that panels get appointed earlier and are involved in the scope determinations and in information gathering decisions. We need to ensure that panels have the budget and the power to hire experts and analysts, and that is particularly important now with a broader scope. And we need to ensure that panel reports include conclusions and recommendations that properly inform determinations under Section 63 and the public interest finding. They can't just be summarizing the findings on the factors in Section 22. We finally need to ensure transparency and accountability for decisions not to follow the recommendations of review panels. The discretion should be there in my view, but there needs to be transparency and accountability when recommendations are not followed. The second area is follow-up. I will just say, in the interest of time, this has been one of the most neglected parts of the assessment process over the last 25 years, and I think we're paying the price for this. We need a process that is transparent at the follow-up stage, and we need to make sure that we gather the information necessary to learn from follow-up in terms of ensuring compliance, adapting conditions for approval, and learning for future assessment. Again, happy to talk more about that. The final point I will make is with respect to strategic and regional assessments. There's been agreement among all major non-governmental stakeholders for at least 15 years now, since the 2003 review, that strategic and regional assessments are critical to improving the effectiveness, efficiency, and fairness of federal project assessments. But we can't seem to make meaningful steps forward in spite of this consensus. I think the Act, as currently proposed, needs more clarity on when these higher-level assessments will be required in the process, on the process, and on how the results will be used. I will end here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. You did have 30 seconds, so just remember the yellow card is not to stop. It means it's just you got a minute left. Okay. Next up, would you like to go next, or who'd like to go next? Go ahead.
I guess it will be over. Bonjour, Madame la Présidente.
Good morning, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the committee for the honor of appearing on behalf of the Centre québécois de droit sur l'environnement. This is a very important moment in our history, and this will affect a huge territory and 3 oceans. And the urgent needs have never been more urgent to deal with this. Ours is the only organization that offers expertise in Quebec, and it has been the case since 1989. Over the last few years, we've had several court cases regarding legislation dating back to Stephen Harper's era and Energy East, and also concerning the Beluga and the protection of the rights of francophones, and to ensure the enforcement of the laws in the province, and particularly also with our Office for Public Hearings. Since 1989, I've been a member of the committee, and I've been actively following this process. I listened to most of the testimony of environmental groups from English Canada as well as Aboriginal groups, and the CQDE supports their positions. I would like to focus on elements that are specific to Quebec. First of all, Quebec has unique experience. We have been carrying out public consultations to assess environmental projects on environmental, social, and economic bases for years, and we've been doing that before the federal government even had such legislation. And for the framework has been modernized in Quebec in this domain, and we have made progress on several of the issues that are fundamental to the study of Bill 69 and that could inform your study. Thirdly, the structure of Bill C-69 seems to largely resemble the structure of the Quebec legislation, and we have significant concerns. And I have summed up the main concerns that I have in the document I gave you this morning. We have to deal with those. And there are aspects of the Quebec legislation that make it a model and that not really reflected in this. And I'm speaking particularly about public participation, independence of the commissions that will review the projects, and I will refer often to the BAPE, Quebec's Office for Public Hearings on the Environment, which is offers minimal guarantees for public participation. And for 40 years, they have assessed some 350 projects. More basically, I seem to be the only representative from Quebec to appear before this federal committee, with the exception of the Cree, Inuit, and Algonquin members, whereas Quebec represents 22% of the Canadian population, and Quebecers have been very involved in the criticism of federal projects since for many years now. Plus, we have a great deal of expertise that could have assisted the committee, and more significantly, we could have proposed concrete solutions as to what actually works in Quebec. So I feel it's unfortunate that you haven't invited these experts, and I once again invite you to invite them. So I'll present our position on this. You have a bilingual copy of the main points if our brief isn't translated for you in time. There was a document tabled by Louis Francoeur before the committee which outlines the BAP's position.
Lawyers and scholars on considerations of climate in the two acts. Also, take questions in English. It will be my pleasure. Donc, premier élément.
So the first component that's very important, respect for rights and laws of provinces and indigenous jurisdictions, including the right including to assess and approve projects on their territory. When they have to also be assessed by the federal government, the process has always really promoted collaboration. Section 39(2) of the Act forbidding this collaboration for pipelines, nuclear energy, offshore oil and gas must be removed from the bill. Secondly, after collaboration, the next thing should be duplication. It's constitutionally possible, but it's not the preferable solution. And thirdly, could be substitution, but if we achieve that, it should be according to the highest standards as recommended by the expert committee, and particularly using objective criteria. The existence of a cap for provinces for emissions does not represent that position for the federal government. Second very important point, the significant participation in the evaluations. That's really at the heart of the Quebec system. The organization that does the assessments in Quebec is the Office for Public Hearings. And so really it's the public that carry out the assessment. It's not just a survey of their opinions to see whether it's socially acceptable. So according to the Francoeur document, this is an evolving process for civilization, and the BAP model is inspired by mechanisms of direct participation that flowed from the American Revolution. The idea was that by forcing the economic and technocratic elites to come and explain their positions before the people directly, public hearings allowed, according to Alexis de Tocqueville, to achieve what these people who are not always accountable, and what makes the procedure, what gives it its strength is, and I will speak a bit more to that, is that it is a model where the people and the Commission play the role of asking the questions, and it's not an adversarial process as it seems to be elsewhere in Canada. Public, in the first phase, deals directly with the issues that the promoter is presenting. So the public acts like the prosecutor in this examination, and the promoter then takes the questions from the public, and they have all the weight of questions put by a commission, and they are obliged to respond. So it's kind of an amalgamation of the work done by the public and the commission, and the people can therefore see the issue developing before it, and it is a model that works, and it guarantees the quality of the report that will be issued at the end, and of the political power and the credibility that this report will have. We believe, humbly, in the province of Quebec, that this kind of model of public participation should be promoted here, and it enlightens the public, and without obliging them to be part of a quasi-judicial process. And this issue of all parties being required to answer the questions and provide documents is central to the BAP's structure. And I have certain concerns with the current bill, particularly with Section 55(6), that this power to comply people to give them information isn't strong enough. And we'll see in the amendments. And so if this an issue has to go before the courts, their power is lost. The other point, the panel has to be truly independent from industry and from government. The bill maintains a minimal number of appointees on review panels for pipeline, nuclear, energy, offshore oil and gas regulators, and it's unacceptable to us. In order to restore the trust, it is of primary importance to create a new assessment institution that is truly independent and that is responsible for all of those industries. I have nothing against them personally, but they are perhaps institutionally biased in the sense that they have a job if they continue to regulate an industry, which implies that the projects must go forward, which means they will always support the projects, and that's one of the reasons why we can't support them. These people have no place on this commission and shouldn't play the role of expert. I have a little bit of time. The transparent decision-making process. We have to create a list of commissioners for specific commissioners to a specific board. The minister shouldn't do this. It should be a more independent process, perhaps 2/3 of parliamentarians, or perhaps the Auditor General and the Commissioner for the Sustainable Environment. I still have a bit of time.
I just want to let you know that we did get your paper distributed, so everybody's got it in front of them with the points that you're making right now.
There is a 10-page version, but I guess it wasn't translated just yet.
Well, when did it get submitted?
On the 6th of April.
Okay, we're working through the translations.
Well, I guess if I can just make one last point, on supporte l'amendement proposé par Louis.
Support the amendment put forward by Louis Francoeur. Change the words sustainability rather than durability.
There was a lot in here. Okay. Next up, would you like to go right ahead? You were going to start before, but please,
Sure.
It's yours.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee and fellow witnesses. C'est un honneur pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui pour présenter les...
It's an honor for me to be here today to present TEC's recommendations on Bill C-59.
Tech resources. And previous to TEC, I worked for the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and for Environment and Climate Change Canada, where I was directly involved in federal impact assessment. I'm accompanied here today by my colleague Mark Freeberg, who also has extensive environmental assessment experience in both Canada and Chile. We'd be happy to answer your questions after our presentation. Proudly Canadian, TEC is a diversified natural company that employs over 8,000 people across the country. TEC est fier d'employer plus de 8,000 personnes au Canada.
TEC is proud to have 8,000 employees in Canada.
Country's largest open-pit copper mine, a zinc and lead smelting complex, and have interests in several mining development and oil sands projects. We also own or have interests in mines in Chile, Peru, and the United States. In all jurisdictions where we operate, we focus on building strong relationships with communities, Indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders. We have significant business arrangements in place with Chinese customers and investors, and from our headquarters in Vancouver, we compete with many of the world's largest mining companies. Many of our activities require environmental assessment, and as a project proponent in Canada, we believe that the design and implementation of this legislation is critical. It matters to ensuring the ongoing protection of the environment, and it matters as well to the long-term competitiveness of our business and the jobs that depend on our success. We support the government's effort to strengthen public confidence in environmental assessment processes and to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation in decision-making. For TEC, the intentions in the government's legislation align with our core business values. In many instances, they describe our existing approach to managing our relationship with the environment and the community at large. New rules that result in greater public confidence in environmental protections will help support and attract investment in this country. However, this represents one part of the challenge as we see it. Project proponents need to know that approval processes will not only be rigorous, but can be counted on and result in clear, timely decisions. We're encouraged by many elements within Bill C-69, but we would like to see more emphasis on a predictable process that delivers regulatory certainty for all parties. Canada has seen its share of global mining investment decrease significantly, and getting this right can help turn this situation around. L'enjeu est particulièrement important maintenant.
The issue is particularly important now, while Canada is seeing a significant reduction in its world share in investments in mining exploration.
The Mining Association of Canada highlighted in its presentation to this committee on March 29th. Today, we'd like to briefly highlight areas of the legislation that we believe could benefit from additional clarity. So I'll focus my remarks on the proposed early planning phase, enhance Indigenous peoples' participation in decision-making, and competitiveness in cost recovery risk structures. First, let me say that we support the inclusion of an early planning phase. This reflects Teck's existing approach to engaging early with stakeholders and Indigenous peoples, and we believe it should be considered a best practice internationally. However, we're concerned that as currently written, the proposed early planning phase does not identify clear milestones within the 180-day period. Defining milestones with clear timelines for the various steps would provide certainty and transparency for all parties involved in the assessment. Proponents need to understand what is expected of them in order to adequately meet early planning requirements. Without this clarity, the early planning phase could continue indefinitely. For example, we recommend that the agency be given set times to deliver the Summary of Issues document. This is the document that describes the issues that the agency has heard to date and the decision on whether an impact assessment is required. We also recommend that the early planning phase contain a mechanism to incorporate information already collected by a proponent or another jurisdiction prior to the 180-day period. Incorporating existing information could significantly streamline the process and incent proponents to conduct even earlier positive engagement with potentially impacted communities and Indigenous peoples. We also recommend that sufficient resources be allocated to the new Impact Assessment Agency to manage this early planning phase well, ensuring it has the capacity to meet its expanded consultation obligations, as well as to review scientific data and Indigenous knowledge. So to summarize, while Teck supports early planning, clear and predictable milestones and sufficient resources are required in order to meet this phase's intent of greater transparency and predictability. En résumé, bien que Teck soit favorable à une étape préparatoire,
In summary, while Teck supports early planning, clear and predictable milestones, and sufficient resources are required in order to successfully meet this phase's intent of greater transparency and predictability.
the early and inclusive engagement and participation of Indigenous peoples at every stage of the impact assessment process. Teck has very positive experiences from early engagement with Indigenous peoples, and we have formalized early, inclusive dialogue into our corporate-wide Indigenous peoples policy. We believe this approach contributes to reconciliation while supporting the shared benefits of resource development. However, this legislation needs to result in clear, consistent practices that governments, Indigenous peoples, and proponents can rely on. For too long, and we hope you will agree, there has been a positive discussion about the need to do better, but perhaps too little by way of clearly defining how we can make this work prescriptions. First, Teck supports the government's commitment to the adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. Currently, however, it is not clear how Bill C-69 will be coordinated with the government's plans to implement the UN Declaration, particularly with regards to free, prior, and informed consent. We recommend that the government engage with industry, provinces, territories, and Indigenous governments to develop a process for the implementation of the UN Declaration with a focus on achieving complete clarity around what is expected when it comes to the terms free, prior, and informed consent. Second, Teck is pleased to see Crown consultation begin earlier in the impact assessment process. For this process to be successful, however, we recommend that there be clarity on the scope of consultation and the division or coordination of consultation efforts between the Crown and the proponent. Finally, while we support the potential for delegation of impact assessment responsibilities to Indigenous governing bodies, we recommend that clear criteria be established that outlines when and how the minister will delegate impact assessment responsibilities. Encore une fois, nous appuyons l'intention du
Again, we support the government's intent to meaningfully involve Indigenous peoples in impact assessment, but seek clarity on how this will be carried out.
Bill C-69 we would like to comment on is the structure of cost recovery under Section 76 through 80 of the legislation. We recognize that reasonable cost recovery is a standard practice in regulatory and permitting processes, and we have experience with cost recovery regimes. We believe that federal cost calculations must consider integration with provincial fees related to the same project. This would be consistent with the federal government's commitment to coordination with provinces to support the one project, one assessment principle. We also believe that federal cost recovery should consider any other fees for mining projects under other federal legislation, such as the Fisheries Act. Doing so would remove costly duplication and support greater cost competitiveness in Canada. One place to coordinate this would be in the proposed Impact Assessment Coordination Plan. Nous recommandons donc que l'agence soit responsable de...
We therefore recommend that a federal impact assessment is required. The agency should be mandated to coordinate cost recovery with other jurisdictions and other federal departments.
Overall support for this government's intent to improve environmental and regulatory processes. Nous appuyons les efforts du gouvernement à cet égard.
Support the government's efforts in this regard, and we're pleased to see that some of our recommendations have been taken into consideration in this bill.
Appear before you today and to highlight further recommendations that we believe provide clarity in Bill C-69. We want to see Canada succeed and become a greater destination for global mining investment and a leader in responsible project development while protecting the environment, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and creating economic opportunities for all Canadians. Nous voulons que le Canada prospère et devienne une destination.
We want Canada to be prosperous and a destination of choice for global mining investment, as well as a leader in responsible project development. I thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
But really appreciate that. And next up, Mr. Carlton.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci à vous tous de nous.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having us today.
Years, so it's nice to see you, nice to engage in this conversation. It's so important. FCM certainly welcomes this opportunity to bring Canada's municipal voice to your review of Bill C-69. As environmental and economic leaders, municipalities understand and support federal efforts to improve environmental assessment processes. Municipalities are uniquely impacted by these processes, sometimes as proponents, sometimes as interested participants, but always as a level of government protecting the interests of our communities. Municipalities are regular participants in environmental assessment where outcomes have a local impact on areas of municipal responsibility, such as environmental sustainability, emergency response planning, land use planning, and the construction and maintenance of municipal infrastructure. At the same time, many projects, including those within the resource development sector, are important to economic prosperity and the quality of life in local communities. In addition to these, as participants, municipal governments are also project proponents directly affected by federal environmental assessments when municipal infrastructure projects are subject to federal approval. In each of the expert panel and House Standing Committee reports that informed the changes proposed in Bill C-69, these reports noted that the unique and growing role of municipalities within environmental assessment processes. So FCM has filed 9 submissions over the last year with recommendations to improve environmental and regulatory review processes. Our recommendations reflect the views of the diverse membership of over 2,000 municipalities representing over 90% of the Canadian population. With responsibility for 60% of the country's public infrastructure, municipalities help drive Canada's economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, and quality of life. To address Bill C-69, I would like to walk the committee through each of the acts that are being changed, starting with the Navigation Protection Act. FCM has consistently recommended aligning the legislation with current transportation demands, which depend more on the construction of bridges and roads than expanding water navigation. In 2009, the former Navigable Waters Protection Act's scope was refined with input from municipalities to include an exemption for minor works in waters with little impact on navigation. Several amendments in 2012 brought aspects of the legislation closer to Canada's modern realities. These changes addressed municipal concerns about project delays and expenses caused by federal reviews triggered by small-scale projects. FCM recognizes and shares concerns about the large number of lakes and rivers that no longer have oversight under the Navigation Protection Act. However, the proposed Canadian Navigable Waters Act includes changes that FCM did not call for and will have significant impacts on municipalities. These include a new requirement that project proponents notify and consult on proposed works on all navigable waters, including both scheduled and non-scheduled water bodies. And a new resolution proposes a new resolution process that would allow the Minister of Transport to review navigation concerns on non-scheduled water bodies. FCM expects these changes will result in significantly more municipal infrastructure projects falling under federal review. And we are concerned about the expansion of the scope of the legislation to include effectively a new class of works that will fall outside of the existing minor works and existing major works categories. These in-between works are likely to include municipal infrastructure projects that are critical to public safety, transportation, and commerce. For example, bridges, water control structures, and flood mitigation structures. We're not advocating that all bridges, water control structures, et cetera, be exempt, but we believe there is a consideration for scale of project and scale of the waterway that needs to be taken into account. To address these, we recommend that, 1, Transport Canada conduct a review of the existing minor works order to assess whether more types of works need to be added. 2nd, Transport Canada create a standardized mechanism for project proponents to notify the public in order to meet new requirements under the Act. And 3rd, highlight the importance of enforcing the timelines for public notification and consultation outlined in Section 10.3, 10.1, and 10.13 as a means of reducing untimely delays, and recommend that these timelines are reviewed and amended as provided for in regulation if they are deemed ineffective. The second part of C69 that FCM has focused on is the changes to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. FCM supports the proposed approach of having designated projects jointly reviewed by the proposed Impact Assessment Agency and the relevant federal life cycle regulators. We also support broadening the scope of assessments to include economic, social, and health impacts, and the one project, one review objective of BC69 strives to achieve. Still, we believe that B69 does not go far enough in recognizing the important role municipalities play in relation to designated projects. For that reason, we are proposing the following amendments: that the Section 11 of the Impact Assessment Act be expanded to expressly include consultation with municipal governments, that this phrase, comments from a municipal government impacted by the designated project, is added as one of the factors that must be considered by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada under Section 22(1) of the Impact Assessment Act, and 3, that as a result of the above amendments, consultation with municipalities is added to the preamble of the Impact Assessment Act, making it clear that this is an objective of the legislation. FCM strongly believes that early engagement with municipalities leads to better outcomes. So we are also calling for consultation with municipalities to be included as a required component of the initial project description that proponents must file with the Impact Assessment Agency. Finally, I'd like to turn to the National Energy Board Act. Municipalities interact daily with the existing network of NEB-regulated pipelines and power transmission lines. Communities of all sizes benefit from economic activity associated with resource development and energy transportation infrastructure. Municipal governments are directly impacted by pipelines through emergency response planning, land use planning, and construction. There are several changes the government has proposed that are in line with FCM's recommendations, but I'd like to address a few recommendations made by FCM that are not clearly addressed. Notably, FCM called for the NEB Act to be amended to recognize municipal bylaws and require pipeline companies and the NEB to abide by municipal bylaws within the limits of the Constitution. We also said that the NEB Act should be amended to provide municipalities with a direct role in deciding the local route that a proposed pipeline project should take. While the proposed changes go a long way to improving public consultation process, they do not go far enough. Codifying the requirement to consult with municipalities in the legislation will go a long way to addressing municipal concerns that have arisen during recent NEB hearings. In addition, FCM is recommending that the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and the Canadian Energy Regulator be granted greater flexibility in determining the maximum time limits for conducting an impact assessment on a proposed pipeline. While FCM supports timelines for environmental and regulatory reviews, we recommend that these should be determined on a project-by-project basis. In conclusion, we want to stress that it will be necessary for the federal government to actively engage and consult municipal governments as regulations of these acts are created. As environmental and economic leaders, municipalities understand the need to balance economic activity and environmental protection as complementary priorities. We believe our recommendations help to achieve this balance. We thank you again, and we look forward to your questions when they arise.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And now Mr. DeMille.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, our 100,000 members, supporters and subscribers, and our 740 clubs across Ontario, thank you for inviting us here today to talk about elements of Bill C-69 that are critically important to our organization. Our primary interest in the bill is the Canadian Navigable Waters Act. Although our organization has a very keen interest in the environmental considerations for projects that occur in and around water, our knowledge and experience in Ontario is mostly related to the Fisheries Act and provincial statutes and regulatory processes, such as Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act. Therefore, we will focus our comments today on the angler, hunter, and trapper perspectives on navigation protection. From the time of the fur trade and well before for Indigenous peoples, navigable waters have been critical for accessing resources in Canada. Water-based navigation remains woven into the cultural fabric and social identity of many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Approximately 1/4 of Canadians fish, hunt, and trap, and they contribute $15.2 billion to the Canadian economy every year. Fishing, hunting, and trapping is very relevant in Canada today, and the right to navigation is important to the Canadians who enjoy those activities. The idea of a public right to navigation is almost as old as the country itself, with navigation legislation having origins dating back to the late 1800s. Although societal demand for water-based transportation has changed dramatically over time, there remains a demand for safe and accessible navigable waters. To achieve this, it requires strong legislative oversight by the federal government. First, we must know what navigability means to Canadians. What are we trying to protect? The most obvious connection to navigability for some Canadians will be lake freighters on the Great Lakes or cabin cruisers on Rideau Canal or the Trent Severn Waterway. Big waters and big boats. When our members think about navigability, however, a high volume of traffic is the last thing they want to see. They are more interested in the navigable backwaters of Canada. Small rivers and streams, creeks, marshes, and other smaller watercourses are important gateways to fishing, hunting, and trapping opportunities. The definition of navigable waters in the proposed Canadian Navigable Waters Act has been enhanced and now provides more detail with specific recognition for recreational use. This is a positive amendment that better reflects our idea of navigability. It is our position that navigation legislation is not intended to be environmental legislation. Are there opportunities for navigation protection to provide a checkpoint to ensure environmental legislation and regulatory processes are happening as they should? Definitely. Projects occurring in and around water should be considered from both a navigation and an environmental perspective. But if we are relying on this Act, past, present, or future forms of it, to be a significant line of defense for environmental protection, then we have to question the effectiveness of our primary environmental statutes, such as the Fisheries Act and Impact Assessment Act. From our perspective, protecting navigability is not about adding red tape for proponents or slowing down development. Large-scale proponent-driven projects are already scrutinized under other legislation and often across multiple jurisdictions. These projects should absolutely be subject to navigability legislation, but the regulatory process must be done in conjunction with other federal approval processes to make it as efficient as possible for the proponent and the agency's benefit. The proposed amendments to have the prohibition applied to major works in any navigable water is a step in the right direction, but more about that later. We are concerned that regulatory processes tend to focus on these proponent-driven medium and large-scale projects, where prohibitions as well as permitting and approval requirements are well established in the development cycle. It is the smaller scale obstructions that do not have the same proponent-agency relationship because the responsible party is more likely to be a private landowner who won't be disclosing their intent to erect a fence, a wire, a rope, or other obstruction across the navigable water. In most cases, the individual is unaware they are breaking the law or even the fact that navigation legislation exists. These obstructions won't be flagged, but they will impede public navigation and create significant safety concerns. For obstructions, and it is important to differentiate obstructions from works or projects, the presence of a legal deterrent and subsequent government recourse to address contraventions can be as important for protecting navigability as the regulatory and permitting process is for traditional proponent-led projects. We want to prevent obstructions to navigability to the greatest degree possible because the average Canadian can't and won't fight these issues in the courts. When navigability concerns do arise, Canadians expect and rely on the federal government to protect navigability. For this reason, we are pleased to see that the amended Act proposes to prohibit obstructions in any navigable water. In our minds, this is a very important change. In addition to legislative measures, navigation protection requires strong education and outreach to increase awareness among Canadians. This should accompany the implementation of the Canadian Navigable Waters Act, particularly as it relates to obstructions that cause serious navigability and public safety concerns. To maintain safe and accessible waters in Canada, we need strong legislation with clear and comprehensive provisions that outline where, when, and how the government will protect navigation. The following are a few more specific comments on the amended navigation legislation proposed in Bill C-69. There has been much discussion about the 2009 and the 2012 amendments to the navigation legislation. Much of what I have read so far has been negative, but that isn't entirely fair. The limitation of the legislation to scheduled list of water bodies was considered a major setback for navigation protection. However, the 2009 amendments established a foundation for classifying different works or projects. This has been maintained in the Canadian Navigable Waters Act and expanded with the inclusion of major works. We believe a classification system that enables prioritization of projects being reviewed for navigation protection is necessary. Firstly, there are differences in the level of scrutiny required for different types of projects. Think the differences between a dock and a dam. In a perfect world, we would want all works, regardless of type, to be assessed and authorized by a regulatory agency. This may have been possible under the broad nature of the Navigable Waters Protection Act prior to 2009. However, we must acknowledge fiscal realities of the Navigation Protection Program and the fact that administrative burden in reviewing all minor works may not be worth the added value to navigation protection. A regulatory triage is now commonly used by agencies to implement regulatory programs. As always, the devil is in the details, and the amended legislation only tells part of the story. We can likely make relatively safe assumptions about what will be defined as minor works because of the existing minor works order under the Navigation Protection Act, but we do not know what types of projects will be included as major works. To achieve a complete and effective major works order, the Minister will need to establish a transparent public consultation process. Only when we know what types of projects are classified as minor and major will we know what is left in between. In other words, what projects won't be subject to navigation protection in unlisted or 99% of Canadian waters. We are still not convinced that special classification of waters in a schedule is necessary or appropriate. If the government can get the classes of works right, then classes of waters shouldn't be necessary. I hope that we've been able to illustrate a different perspective on the proposals to amend navigation legislation and have offered the committee with value-added feedback and will contribute to your study and ultimately bring meaningful change to the bill and its implementation. Thank you again, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for the invitation and for your attention today. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful presentation there. So we'll start with Mr. Bosio with questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, guests, for being here today. We really appreciate the testimony you've brought to this committee and the huge efforts that you've put forward in trying to address some of the concerns around this bill. I want to address public participation, and I'm going to direct my question towards Mr. Dole. Once again, thank you very much for being here today. I guess, in the Act, it talks about public participation, but it doesn't really delve much beyond that. Do you feel that there should be a definition for meaningful public participation, and do you feel that that there needs to be parameters that are defined around meaningful public participation in different sections of the Act? So, for example, a definition within Section 2 and parameters within Section 6, 11, 22, 27, 31, 51, that sort of thing. Could you provide some details there?
Sure. Thank you very much. So I think public participation is a good example of the kinds of issues that I was talking about more generically. This question of how do you move from empowering decision makers to do the right thing to properly guiding the decision making. So the short answer is I think a definition for meaningful public participation would be a helpful first step. But I think then what you need to do is you need to work through the Act and identify appropriate direction, statutory and regulatory, to ensure that good decisions will be made in the future about public participation. So for me, a good starting point for that would be to think about setting up an advisory committee for the planning phase, and start to think about, and probably in regulation, who should be on those kinds of advisory committees. Because if you get it right early, if you get it right in the planning phase, and you get all the key interests involved in designing the process, designing the scope, determining what information you need to make good decisions at the end of the day, then I think a lot of the challenges can be overcome early on. But I think you want to also think about how you make good decisions as you go along. So, for example, as I said in my presentation, we often think about, and rightly so, as the panel review, as being the ultimate and the highest level of assessment. But even in that context, different mechanisms sometimes are most effective. It's not always most effective to have a traditional style hearing. We've had provision for mediation, ADR, for a long time. We've never used them. So thinking carefully about how we ensure that the broad range of tools are used effectively to achieve good outcomes is critical, because often bringing people together, and I can talk at length about what we did with strategic assessments in Nova Scotia on very controversial issues like aquaculture, where we brought people with opposing views together, and we came out of that process where at the starting point people were saying moratorium or nothing, and we came up with a design, with a solution that everyone applauded, right? So having good and effective public participation processes that work for the context is critical. Depending on what First Nations or Indigenous communities are involved, having public participation processes that work for them, again, is critical to properly engaging them. If you want to avoid opposition and bring those that are affected along and have a process that results in a common vision at the end, public participation is critical, and providing the proper guidance in the statute and through regulations.
Madam Palafi, would you like to add to that?
Yes, to the extent that the agency would act as a secretariat to the commissions, actually in all contexts, maybe you could add as a purpose of the agency the purpose of promoting significant, meaningful public participation, significative in French. A definition could be helpful. Also, insisting on public hearings, not just submitting comments online. Like getting people in the room together is a great way of learning, much better than just based on paper. At least that's been one key success in Quebec. But to be fair, I've looked for a legal component that showed why the map works so well in Quebec, and it's actually a question of institutional culture. So the first people that will be named as commissioners and will do reviews and how they will set the culture of the new institution. That's not a legal requirement, it's just the importance of the first people that will be there.
Thank you so much. I was just going to give Mr. Carleton an opportunity. I know that you had raised that as well in your submission around participation, in particular with municipalities, but meaningful public participation, would you agree, would capture that notion as well?
No, actually, I wouldn't agree with that. Not that I disagree with meaningful public consultation. I agree with meaningful public consultation. What I don't agree with is lumping municipal government into something as generic as public participation. Municipal government are governments.
Right.
And thus our comments are to single out municipalities as unique creatures or features of any kind of consultation process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gooden.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for being here this morning. I think there's a good representation of Canada here with people from Nova Scotia and the people representing the FCM, Ontario, with the Hunters and Anglers, Quebec, with the Quebec Environmental Law Centre, and with the people from New Brunswick, or British Columbia, rather. So I'll start with Mr. Dahl. It's interesting what you presented as comments, and I'd like to go a little bit further on the appeal process before a specialized tribunal. I think that that is a really interesting component, but that it's at the end of the process, at the end of the line. Would it not be better to have rules and parameters that are clear in place before getting to that point in order to speed the process up and lighten up the administrative aspects of it?
Question correctly. I'm advocating for an appeals body that would potentially review decisions throughout the process. So starting potentially from triggering decisions to determinations on the scope, on the information that is needed, process options, so all along the way. So for me, the basic concept is that you want appropriate statutory direction, you want appropriate regulatory direction. There will still be discretion. We need discretion to make good decisions. And then you have the opportunity to appeal the decision if you're unhappy with it to this independent tribunal. That independent tribunal, throughout the process, then can ensure consistent application and responsible application of the guidance that is provided in the statute and regulations. So I'm actually not at all focused on the ultimate decision. On the ultimate decision, my view is that that should be a political decision. Even there can be aspects that can be reviewable. So, for example, whether or not the decision maker has applied the factors in Section 63 should be reviewable. But the decision itself, in my view, shouldn't be. So I do see the appeal body as an efficient way of developing a consistent application of the statutory and regulatory criteria that are established for all the critical decisions in the process.
Merci. Maintenant,
Thank you. Now, you'll understand that as we are drafting legislation, we have to define things as clearly as possible. So the option of having this appeal tribunal is one option, but we're trying to ensure that the rules and regulations be as clear as possible. Secondly, I have a question for Ms. Pelofi. I don't know, Ms. Pelofi, but I think I'm very disappointed with your comment. You're the only one who spoke about the government. Everyone here around this table is here to build the future. We're here looking that way, and what has been done in the past is in the past. I appreciate Mr. Dahl's comment. When we drafted the legislation 25 years ago, that's one step, but now we're taking a further step. So I appreciate that all parliamentarians are working in that regard, and I didn't appreciate your comments. And concerning what Mr. Harper did, I can tell you that everything is not all written on one single page. It's not a blank page. And for representation, one thing you should know, all of the people here represent all of the people in Canada. I'm very proud to be a Quebecer. I'm very proud to be a Canadian. And the Canadian Federation of Municipalities represents part of the municipalities in Quebec, and other witnesses have as well. So I need to remind you that the greenhouse gas targets that are supported by the current government were set up by the Harper government with using science and research, and the work was well done. And it was well done because the Liberals are using that now. So thank you, Ms. Pelofi. I'm happy to make that comment to you. My third question is for Ms. Riesbud. Ms. Riesbud, I'd like to hear your comments on the process currently. Does it achieve the principles and the objectives of the Act? If I understand your question correctly, it's concerning the current law? No, my question is on the bill that we are studying here today. Does it really achieve the principles and objectives. The government claims that it's going to speed up the process, and so do you believe that we're meeting those objectives? Yes, overall, we support the intentions of the bill. We do believe it reflects the best practices in terms of environmental assessment. We have a few suggestions that we put forward today concerning giving a little more clarification on the first phase, the planning phase, that's of course at the outset, as well as the clarification concerning the role of Indigenous people in the consultation. So once we see those details, we really believe that the bill is heading in the right direction. All right, now with the bagage you have and the knowledge that you have, Canada would be ranked what on the list of countries, in your opinion, that are working positively towards setting forth rules to protect the environment? Well, I don't have a list before me, but based on our international experience as a mining company, Canada would be very high on that list. Thank you very much.
6 minutes will go by very quickly. Most of my questions are going to be to Professor Dole, but to Mr. Carleton, if I can offer a better suggestion to you in the fact that you want municipalities recognized, although I have to share with you my experience with municipalities involved in hearings on major projects, is usually they're supporting exactly it goes forward and rarely support more conditions on the project. That's my experience in Alberta. But under jurisdiction, it doesn't appear obvious in the definition of jurisdiction that that includes municipalities. So I think it'd be a good idea for us to refer to maybe the legal people, the legislative drafters. Are municipalities included there? If they're not, then I think it'd be a good idea to add it in there. I fully agree with you that I don't think that they come under public. I've got much bigger questions about definition of public, because I don't think that Indigenous peoples think they are public. So there are bigger problems with this bill even than what you're identifying. I think you're raising a very genuine point, and I think it'll be up to us to look at, if we want to make sure municipalities, their issues are heard, what are the best ways to do that in the bill. But I think that might be the best place to put it. Professor Dole, thank you very much for your papers, your blogs, and your submission. I'm absolutely delighted in your submission that one of the areas you focus in on is the panel. And I'm deeply troubled by this bill because there's absolutely no clarity on when a review is going to be by the agency, when it's going to be by a panel, when a panel is appointed. And you're making some very good suggestions. We're challenged for time. We have to have all of our amendments in by next Tuesday. I would welcome any suggestions to sections that you recommend. You've also recommending that a panel should provide in its decision a summary of the evidence in each of the factors and the recommendations to respond. One of the questions I'd like to put to you, Professor, is what troubles me deeply is whether the agency is going to review the matter, whether or not the matter should even be reviewed, assessment by the agency, whether it's reviewed by a panel, and in turn, whether it's in the public interest. They're all different factors. Do you think that that's a problem? Do you think that there should be consistency throughout on what the factors are that are taken into account and not just quote-unquote considered?
Yeah, so I think as much as possible, and I'm not sure whether your question is specific to the choice about panel review or agency review or more general, but as much as possible, the approach that I would recommend is that the broad criteria should be set out in the statute. So you want to put in statute the kinds of things that you know you're not going to have to change, right? And then what you want is you want to require regulations to provide the detail, and you want the detail to be adjustable. So I think I would advocate for ministerial regulations to provide the detail. And so that's a general recommendation. So, but that would apply to the choice of going to the agency or panel review, because as you point out, currently it says consider. They're very broad criteria. They're not inappropriate, but they do not properly direct decision making, and we have 25 years of experience, we can give better direction to decision makers than that, so we can avoid bad decisions. And as I said, I don't think this is the intent, but what happens over time is there is pressure to approve projects, there is pressure to streamline because of financial constraints. So there are all kinds of pressures on decision makers that make it hard to make good decisions. And so having proper direction in regulations is a good safeguard against that. So I think the criteria are appropriate, but they're inadequate. So that's what I meant when I said early on. I think the Act generally gives the powers that are needed to make good decisions, but it doesn't give proper direction.
Another aspect of the bill that you point out is it's basically vacuous on the procedures of the panel. For example, there's no power in the panel to scope the review. There needs to be some kind of, do you agree there needs to be some kind of bringing together of the agency planning process, and then, like normally my experience before review panels is they sit down with all the parties and they say, okay, how are we going to scope this review? And that helps to reduce the time.
Yeah, so in fairness, we've never been clear about that. SIA 1992 wasn't clear on that. But I do think that it's time to provide some clarity on this. And I think there is more uncertainty as a result of the planning phase now, because the planning phase now talks about asking for information, which is a good idea. But it does raise questions about, is that a scoping decision, or is that just inviting some information? So it is less clear now when the scoping decisions are made and what the role of the panel is. And I think one of the most troubling effects of practice over time has been that the role of the panel in scoping has been reduced over time.
Looks like we're almost finished. I also like your ideas about the bill prescribed a baseline for the time for the review, but the actual time be assessed when you know what kind of a project you're dealing with. And then adding that there should be expertise and assistance and a budget for the agency to work as a secretariat for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move to the next question, I just want to welcome Elizabeth May and Madame Posé to the table. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay, Mr. Amos.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank all of our witnesses. It's very much appreciated, and I'm happy that we have a representative from a Quebec organization, and I agree with Mr. Godin in that regard. My first comment, because I know that it's very possible to be inspired from other processes across the country, like the BAP in Quebec, but for a long time, we've been working on environmental assessments for a long time, and the BAP system in Quebec has also been the subject of many criticisms, and so I'm wondering if there aren't any lessons that have been learned for the BAP system, particularly with the terms that the BAP has that are perhaps too limited or restricted. They have a lack of power in terms of follow-up, and that, in fact, the responses are political and not provided for in the legislation. So these are extremely important issues, and we're currently facing that. So could you comment on that, please? Yes. And it must be said that some of these limitations have been addressed in the modernization on the quality of the environment, and to make a parallel with the preliminary phase of Bill C-69. But when the public will be consulted on the substance of all of that at the very beginning of the process, which should help before the project goes before the BAP. And the process of appointments has been amended as well. And the mechanisms that the BAP can use is now broader. So there are targeted consultations, mediation was always possible, and so there are several mechanisms for public participation that are possible. And indeed, in Quebec, the decision remains to be a political one. But apparently what justified this model at the outset was the idea that the Quebec nation was small enough that a rigorous report that had the trust of the public could create enough public pressure for the politicians to take the right decision. I don't think that for Canada that is really the situation, and thus there is the importance for having even more carefully framed decisions that are made that are based on reports and science. Having the possibility of appealing the decisions, and that's the biggest weakness of the Quebec system. Thank you for that comment, and I'll come back to that in a subsequent question.
What we have right now is a proposal for a series of 5 criteria for cabinet decision making. So we've had at least the makings of bound decision making or framed decision making, but the challenge is, and how does that get tightened up appropriately so that the clearly political discretion is appropriately anchored. So I'd ask Mr. Dwell to comment on that aspect. There are specific criteria that are identified. I wonder if you could comment on how could those specifically be even more tightly constraining so that when Cabinet is faced with a challenging question, they've got a report in their hands, but they need clear guidance, and also to provide guidance to the courts when the judiciary are engaged in those matters that become litigious.
Thanks. So I assume you're referring to Section 63. Yeah. So I actually personally think that other than changing the language from considering to based on, Section 63 is fine. What is needed in addition to this, as with other discretionary decisions, I think, is that we need regulations to provide the detail. I don't think it would be appropriate to provide more of the detail in the statute. This is going to be a learning process. We're moving from a focus on biophysical to sustainability to a broader consideration of effects. We're not going to get this perfect the first time around. So I think it's critical to provide the guidance, the further guidance in regulations so that we can adjust with experience. The other piece that's critical, though, for the final decision is not just a matter of providing the direction, but I think we need a better we need to track the relationship between the agency or panel report and the decision by the minister or cabinet. And the way to do that is to make it clear that the assessment report itself is framed around the Section 63 factors and the conclusion about public interest. And then I think what we should add is what we had in SIA 1992, which was a requirement for the decision maker to justify when they choose, which they should be free to, when they choose not to follow the recommendations. So clear recommendations, clear analysis in the report on Section 63 and public interest, and then a requirement to justify not following.
Thank you for that. Okay. Would you have any recommendations in relation to how the federal court system will or won't be able to succeed in dealing with disputes that arise pursuant to cabinet decisions?
So, no
Very
time?
quick.
My preference overall is to focus on the appeals tribunal. I don't have a magic answer to you on the cabinet issue, but I would focus on the appeals tribunal as the way of ensuring proper application of the guidance that is provided in the legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Fast?
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of our guests. I'm going to direct most of my questions to Mr. Carleton, but before I do, I want to ask Ms. Pelletier one question. Did I understand you to say that you want all projects to undergo an assessment review?
Well, all projects, once we have a certain criteria to define them, not every single action going on in Canada, that's physically impossible. But yes, I think every single project that has the potential to have an impact on an area of federal jurisdiction should be assessed. I think Stuart Elgie said we shouldn't define federal jurisdiction in this act. I think I would agree. This act will need to be implemented according to the Constitution, and the jurisdiction arises at when you make conditions for approval, not when you assess.
Okay, which is a good preface to my question to Mr. Carleton. Back in 2012, our previous Conservative government made a number of changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and we made a distinction between minor and major projects to make sure that the minor projects weren't caught up in the incredible red tape that a full impact assessment would require. You've now had a chance to review this bill, Bill C-69. If the amendments that you've suggested here at the table today are not made, do you believe that Bill C-69 will make it more difficult for local projects to be approved?
Well, as I said in my comments, that the fact that we have this middle ground that captures of sort of undefined structure between minor and major works. If those are if the act doesn't change, there will be more municipal projects under review than were the case if we did not review the minor order, the definition of minor works order.
Which means that costs to municipalities will increase because there are additional review and assessment burdens they would have to meet.
Yeah. Potentially.
Yeah. Okay, I also want to check one other statement you made. I believe you said when you were talking about consultation and that municipalities be singled out in the legislation as being an order of government that needs to be consulted in a very significant way. I believe you also said that applicants who are having projects reviewed should also be compelled to comply with municipal bylaws.
Within the limits of the Constitution, yes.
All right. I'm glad you qualified that.
Yeah.
It's very, very important because what we see play out in British Columbia today is municipalities, a number of municipalities who are using their bylaw-making powers to thwart the duly approved Kinder Morgan pipeline project. And of course the courts will determine whether in fact they've exceeded their jurisdiction. I'm confident they did exceed their jurisdiction, but it would be very hurtful to our ability to develop much needed infrastructure and also resource projects across Canada if we're caught up in this game of federal approvals being thwarted by municipal governments who are using their bylaw-making power to do that.
No, I think we're fairly clear that the municipalities do have a bylaw-making capacity, and that bylaw capacity needs to be respected within the constraints of the Constitution as it exists. And just to your very first point, yes, we do believe that municipalities need to be identified separate from a public consultation process generally, so that municipalities are considered orders of government that are involved in a unique way in the consultation mechanisms.
Yeah. Let me ask you a more direct question on that then. Bill C-69, is it going to speed up the review process, or is it going to slow down the review process?
Well, we're recommending some changes so that the timeliness of the review process is appropriate. So as we say, in some instances, we think the timelines need to be defined and adhered to so that we don't end up with endless delays. But when we look at the National Energy Board work in the pipelines, we think that there's a project-by-project need for review of timelines because of the complexity and the size of these projects.
You've had a chance to review the discretionary powers given to the Minister and Cabinet to extend and suspend timelines within the Impact Assessment Act. Are you concerned about the uncertainty that will create?
Yeah, we don't really have a position on that.
You don't have a position? Okay. Perhaps I could ask Mr. Freeberg or Ms. Risbud. Thank you for your testimony. You've generally been supportive of the legislation. You've suggested some amendments that would be required. You've had a chance to review the discretionary powers given to the Minister and Cabinet. Are you satisfied that they are circumscribed enough to be able to provide the kind of predictability that will continue to attract investment to Canada?
Yes, we support the idea that final decision-making should occur at the political level. There needs to be some criteria that set that out. I think we're generally supportive of that approach that's been taken in the Act, yes.
Okay, those are my questions.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. That was good timing. Darren, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, folks, very much for being here. Brock, great to see you again. I was on municipal council, as you know, in Halifax for 7 years, so I got to deal with you quite a bit at FCM. So welcome, and I look forward to seeing 2,000 of your closest friends in Halifax in just 5 weeks.
3,000 of my closest
3,000.
friends, yes.
Well, that's because we have a new convention center now, exactly. So, Brock, because we have multi-levels of government, that poses unique challenges for the impact assessment. So, every order of government is only able to regulate the matters within their own jurisdictions. So we know that cooperation is imperative. We have to have cooperation. And notwithstanding your comments and the recommendations that you had in your testimony about explicitly listing municipalities in there, and I do think that there are changes to this legislation from 2012 that do take municipalities and some of your recommendations into play. But I'm interested in if maybe you can expand a little bit on what you notice in C69 that does ensure cooperation and input from all levels of government, especially from the early planning phase.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to take that. Thanks for the question. In our written submission, we acknowledged, and I can reiterate today, that the addition of the early planning phase it does provide a mechanism to include municipalities. I think our concern, as Brock stated, is that that's not a requirement, and so we're asking for that to be strengthened and codified in the statute. But I think we are supportive, as we indicate in our submission, that with the early planning phase there will be more and more broad engagement, and that also by looking at a larger, a broader list of factors to consider, bringing in health and social impacts, that concerns that municipalities have related to responsibilities for public safety, public health, do have an opportunity to be considered in more depth. And so we support those changes that do that. But as we said, we're asking for that to be taken a step further.
Okay. And notwithstanding Ms. Duncan's experiences with municipalities in one part of the country, the municipalities I've dealt with in my part of the country take the environment very, very seriously. So I think that they're going to be a great partner in this. Mr. DeMille, so I represent Dartmouth Cole Harbour. We have lots of waterways, lots of lakes. Dartmouth is called the City of Lakes. Impediments to navigation and the enjoyment of all waterways. The complaints mechanism, is it simple enough? Is it rigorous enough? Are Canadians going to be able to know how they are able to lodge complaints when navigation is impeded?
I think that's one of the points that we were trying to make, is that sometimes we get caught up in the legislation and the regulations, but the education and outreach is probably just as important to, particularly in our experience with landowners and groups of landowners, to engage them and let them know that there is navigation legislation and what it means for them, and if they're doing something on their lands that's going to impede navigation, what they need to do about it. The second part of that would be what you're talking about, is with individuals. So individuals or groups with the public to be able to come forward. I think in our experience is that often the reason that complaints probably aren't heard as much as issues are happening is that people don't know that there's recourse.
They don't know that there's recourse. Those that do know that there's recourse, is there comfort in how our process would be for them to field that complaint?
I think,
and if not, how could we strengthen that?
It's a good question, and I don't think that I have a good answer right now for exactly how that would work and what it would look like. And so I think that when we see the details of that and see how it actually works operationally, I think then that's when you can really start to look at what needs to be done.
I think there's been such a change. There was a time and every town had one newspaper and everybody got their news from one place. And I think it makes it more difficult on governments now to get that word out, and ensuring that Canadians have the ability and the simple process to allow them to voice their concerns, I think is... How much time do I have left, Madam Chair?
Just about a minute.
I'll pass my minute on to Mr. Amos for a short snapper.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Dewell, could you please opine further on how you would like to see a specialized tribunal structured?
Yeah, so the basic idea would be that you identify what decisions along the way can be appealed to that tribunal. It would be, the tribunal would be independent, and it would hear appeals either from anyone that is that has an interest in the process, and it would be an expedited process. It would develop rules of procedure. So I don't think it's complicated to set it up. The key issue is to ensure its independence and to identify what decisions can be appealed to that body.
Okay, you're pretty much done. You've got another round coming up, but Mr. Sopak.
Thank you. Mr. Carleton, I appreciate your comments on the Navigable Waters Protection Act. I have 36 municipalities in my constituency, and just a little quick anecdote here. Spring freshet tore out a culvert. This ravine had water in it for perhaps a month a year. Well, the bureaucracy told the municipality that they had to put a bridge there because it was considered a navigable water, which was clearly ridiculous. Which made it even more ridiculous is that the estimated cost of the bridge was $750,000, and the total budget of the municipality was $1 million. So we changed the stupid law that did stupid things, like I've just described, and I'll stand by the changes we made to the Navigable Waters Act any day. It's all about the definition of what a navigable water is, and also I think municipalities advocating for economic development and resource development, the three of us here, we think that's a good thing. So keep up the good work in that regard. I'd like to direct my next questions to Teck Resources. Pierre Gratton, the head of the Mining Association, was before us a while ago, and he made the point that in spite of the fact that commodity prices are increasing around the world, investment in mining and natural resource development in Canada is actually going down. It's fleeing this country. You alluded to it, Ms. Risba, but I think your criticism, I think your point was far too mild. When I see the testimony from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, they talked about how Canada is losing investment, and they see very little in C69 that will improve that. Chris Bloomer from the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association made the point that Canada has a toxic regulatory environment. He used the word toxic in his testimony, and he said if the job is to kill oil and gas production and pipelines, this bill will do a very good job. And I noticed on your website, I know you're not in the pipeline business, but you're in the steel-making coal business. So when pipelines are not built, your company and your employees are directly affected. Can you comment on why investment in Canada is declining, and it's in the billions, it's down 56%, at a time when commodity prices around the world are increasing?
I think there are many factors that affect competitiveness in Canada. Getting a robust regulatory process in place that offers greater certainty is one element. It is not the only element. I'm not here to talk about those other elements today. I'm here to talk about impact assessment, and we've made some recommendations on how we think that this process can be done right and clearly in order to restore investor confidence in Canada and make Canada a global mining destination.
Well, again, I'm surprised because the representatives of the various natural resource industry associations directly focused on the effect of this legislation on investment. So I'm surprised at your reluctance to talk about that, because that to me is the key issue. At least the three of us here, we believe in economic development, jobs, and livelihoods. And having lived in a resource town where the forest company went away, the human wreckage that's left behind, and it's the same in mining communities when these communities close down. And as well, the mining industry overall is the largest employer of Indigenous people in Canada. So, and Mr. Gratton made that question, or that made that point very forcefully. So Australia seems to be eating our lunch in terms of the mining world. What does Australia do that's better than Canada in terms of attracting investment? Because their investment in mining is skyrocketing, as I understand it. Would you comment?
Unfortunately, we can't comment specifically on Australia. I don't think either of us. Our company is not active in Australia. I'm aware of some of the things they do. Their process does appear to be faster, but I'm not really in a position to talk to you about the specifics of what the practices in Australia are versus what's proposed in this bill.
Well, and again, I've got a legal opinion in front of me here, and the legal opinion says, despite the Government of Canada's suggestion that the new legislation will improve the efficiency and timing of reviews, there is nothing in the new legislation that will necessarily achieve these results, and many aspects of the legislation will likely have the opposite effect, and that's the opinion from Osler and Company. That's a natural resource law firm. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're done?
Yep.
Okay. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the panelists for appearing today. I've got a question, I think, for Brock, as with my municipal background, of course, and I want to talk a little bit about municipalities. FCM is the umbrella organization for all municipalities and governments across the country, big and small. Some are pretty tiny, some are large. How does the Federation of Canadian Municipalities overall, I guess, view this new proposed legislation, C-69? In your opinion, does it improve or hinder the future work that municipalities will have to undertake under this proposed legislation?
We think it's a step in the right direction, as there's work to be done, improvements to be made that we've identified in the comments today and in the submissions that we've made. Like I said, there was 9 submissions over the life of this consultation process.
So in terms of land use planning, future land use planning, construction or things around roads, bridges, that kind of thing, does this bill go far enough in terms of addressing the concerns of the municipal sector?
Well, there's, as I said in my comments, the question about the definition of minor works and major works, and this right now, this kind of mushy middle of the act applying to non-scheduled waters in a way that's not clearly defined is a challenge for the municipalities. And so we're, as I said, we're looking for a clearer definition of the minor works order, particularly as a way of ensuring that there's an appropriate balance of environmental protection, navigable water protection, and the opportunity for small projects to go ahead in an appropriate way.
Okay. Madam Chair, Mr. Fass actually asked a couple of questions I had for the municipal sector, so I've got how much time?
Oh, you've got 4 minutes.
Okay. So Ms. May, I know, was looking for some time, so I'm going to graciously pass her the opportunity.
Thank you. That's so kind of you. Thanks, Mr. Rogers. Look, one of the things that came up in this discussion about municipalities, and as an observation, and perhaps I'd ask Professor Dole or Karine if you have any thoughts, is we tend to focus on environmental assessment as though it's a bad thing that slows down good projects. But in my experience, the failure to do EA often leads to a tremendous waste of money and bad projects. So since you're from Nova Scotia, Professor Doyle, do you recall back in the early 90s, the first proposed cleanup of the Sydney tar ponds was exempted from EA, and they spent $80 million on a set of piping to a location for a future incinerator that didn't work. I just wonder if you wanted to comment on the planning tool, because I see EA as primarily a planning tool, not a fast track to yes or no. Bad projects waste money when they're not assessed, and I wonder if you have any comments on how significant the process is as a planning tool.
I think that's critical. I mean, I think as a general comment, I would say that the greatest risk that I see of any kind of assessment or regulatory process to projects is the uncertainty that is associated with the loss of social license. So environmental assessments are an opportunity to gain that social license. And that's where, I mentioned earlier, aquaculture is an example where we did a strategic assessment in Nova Scotia. We did the same with tidal energy, where there was strong opposition to both ideas when we started, and we, through an effective engagement process with all interested parties, we came to common ground. We identified what the concerns were, what the legitimate concerns were. We found a way to get them addressed, and ultimately the end product is that good projects can go ahead. And there's more certainty as a result of that than you would have if you had a shorter, firm process, but then all kinds of uncertainty at the end of the process because of litigation and political opposition to the project. So, and there are hundreds of examples of that.
Yeah, I'll stay with you for just a minute, Professor Dole, and that's your brief says criteria are warranted, and thank you for listing the many areas of the bill where there's too broad discretion. But you suggested triggering. This question of federal jurisdictions come before. I'll be quite out front about it. I'm a fan of federal land, federal money, and a law list, so you know what you're doing. I wonder if you have any comments on what kind of triggers you think are appropriate.
I think there are many different ways to do that, and certainly I think the old process worked. And I think we got to a point where it was fairly refined. But I think that a project list can also work. The key issue is not whether you take a definition and a list and a law list approach, or whether you take a project list approach. The key question is, how do you decide what's on and what isn't? And so I think we need better criteria, broad criteria in the statute, and then regulations that help ensure that good decisions are made about what should be on the list and whether you assess something that is on the list.
Can I squidge in one quick one for Karine?
30 seconds?
Yeah, your brief says that you don't see any role, they have no place to have nuclear regulators, the NEB, or offshore regulators on panels. I wonder if you can explain why.
As I said, because their jobs will be to regulate the projects. If they want to have a job, there needs to be projects going forward. So that's pretty much an institutional bias in favor of approving projects. And we, from the BAP experience in Quebec, we think generalists are better placed to integrate the socio-economic and environmental consideration rather than very narrow expertise. And if I can just piggyback, the role of municipalities is key. The Quebec law recognizes in its sustainable development principles the principles of subsidiarity, and it would be great if the federal law did the same.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ms. Duncan. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you 6 minutes. We're going to add one more round to each of the sides for 6 minutes, and then I think we are out of time. Okay.
I think I just have one question, although I could ask lots of them, back to Professor Dole. And I'd like you to speak a little bit more about the appeals tribunal. One thing that I find really odd is the government insisted on putting these 3 acts together in one bill. It's presumably that they would relate to each other. And yet for Part 2, for the CER, they have ADR and they have appeals. But we don't have it in the first part of the bill. So is one option just to bring forward those same provisions, that ADR could work very well as well in the assessment process in some way. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about the difference between appeals to the federal court on matters of law or fact and law, or this appeals tribunal, and who would sit on that tribunal? And do we have a problem because it's not in the bill? They're going to say that we need a royal rec.
Yeah, so I'll let others comment on the last point. I mean, I think there are many different ways to do this, but the challenge with the Federal Court of Appeal is, number one, judicial deference. So some of the administrative law cases since Dunsmuir have not been very helpful in providing an appropriate rule for the Court of Appeal, and it's a drawn-out, expensive process. So it won't be timely, and unless you create a specialized subgroup of the Court of Appeal, they also won't necessarily have the expertise. I think a separate body that has specialized expertise, is independent, and can quickly review decisions based on clearly established criteria in statute and regulations is a very efficient and effective and fair way of improving the quality of decision making in EA. To me, that's the answer. Now, having said that, one of the things that some of us who saw these various acts come along at the same time were advocating for is the consideration of a specialized environmental court, similar to what Australia has. And there was a question earlier about what's Australia doing well. Australia and New Zealand, at various levels of government, have specialized courts.
And Bangladesh.
And they can be much more effective, much more efficient at making decisions. Having said that, at this point, I think a good step forward would be just a small-scale, specialized tribunal that hears appeals on key decisions in the process.
Madame Posé, you can have the rest of my time.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Madame Duncan. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Duncan, and thank you, Madam Chair. I'd also like to thank the witnesses. It's most interesting. And of course, I'd like to congratulate Ms. Pelofi for having begun her presentation by saying that acting on biodiversity has never been such a great need. Mr. Dahl, you spoke about the public interest. You talked about social license and acceptability, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities also said that too often this was not taken into account, what you wanted to protect. And so I would ask Ms. Pelofi if her amendment to Section 69 of the law, 63 rather, would not deal with the shortcomings that we identified. Well, the amendment we're proposing is indeed to clarify the role of the provinces and that the Aboriginal groups should be protected or at least taken into account when taking a federal position. But what it specifically deals with is to try and avoid what's happening often now, which is that promoters or proponents don't respect provincial legislation. We've seen a lot of that in Quebec right now. It would solve the problem of protecting the municipalities' rights because the right of the province in which they are situated gives them rights. Municipalities are the creation of the provinces, and we recognize this principle, and we could do a lot more on the environmental front, and I'll stop there.
Je vais l'avoir.
Worry about the mics. They are controlling it up here, so they'll know who's talking, and turn your mic on.
Merci. Donc, vous avez...
Thank you. You also talk about Mr. Franck Coeur, who was an outstanding environmental journalist and who was a commissioner also for the environment, and you said that he was proposing to translate sustainable by durabilité. I'd like to hear a little bit more on that. Yes, he wanted to use viability rather than sustainability, and I don't know if I can really do justice to his eloquence. He's a writer and a journalist, but the word sustainability in French doesn't sound very good. It sounds like something's going to last in and of itself, whereas viability seems to really speak to those concepts better. So I have 4 paragraphs on that I could read to you, but it's a term that I think would move the debate forward much better. It would be a better translation of what we're trying to see by sustainability from the Branckton report, which goes back a long ways. Thank you.
30 seconds.
I know this is an ongoing debate and there is a block bill to do with this, but surely we can't go beyond the constitutional rule that the federal government has paramountcy over provincial. But maybe in your Section 63, this is why I'm saying the factors throughout should be the same. I don't understand why they should be reduced down by the time you get to the public interest determination, and they should take in consideration any matters raised, including by provinces or municipalities.
Well,
we're almost out of time, so real quick.
Real quick. One of the things that having that amendment for respect for provincial law would do is stop the arguments about frustration of purpose of federal laws. There's a court of appeal, this court being heard in Quebec, where basically the previous government, who shall not be named, created a legal vacuum, and the courts are using this legal vacuum as reason to say that the space is occupied by the federal government and that displaces provincial laws. This is extremely problematic for us and not the state of the constitutional law, and that's why we're at the Court of Appeal on it.
Okay.
But that idea of frustration of purpose should be out. We should just look for objective conflicts of law.
Thank you for that. Sorry to rush you. It's we're just really time crunch now. Mr. Fast.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is directed to Mr. Dole. You've mentioned that specialized expertise should be present in an appeal mechanism. You also said that Canada should be developing an environmental core. I believe that's the term you used.
Court.
Court. All right. I want to refer you to the testimony of Ms. Pelosi. She said she would prefer that there be generalists making these decisions, at least in the first instance. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, so I think my co-panelist was speaking about the panel decisions.
That's right.
Whereas my comment was about the more specialized function of the tribunal to review the decisions that are being made. And I think you need specialized legal expertise and EA expertise to determine whether the determination that is made is appropriate. I wouldn't want the appeals tribunal to second guess the decisions that are being made. That's not their job. Right? I want the panel to make the determination about, what the impacts are and so on. But I would advocate for an appeals tribunal that has the expertise to determine whether the criteria and direction that is being given in the Act and the regulations is being properly applied by the decision makers. Beyond that, decision makers should be free to exercise the discretion that they've been given. And that requires the broader general expertise that my co-panelist, I think, was talking about.
Okay. Do you believe the expertise that's required in the appeal process is one that we're missing in Canada right now?
I don't think we're missing the expertise. We're just missing the institution to apply it.
Okay. Let me talk to you a little bit about the intersection of the science and then the political reality, which is the decision makers are making political decisions. Even though they should be basing it on science, there is always a political consideration that comes into play. At the end of the day, you're still comfortable with having politicians make the final decision on any particular project?
I am. I have no difficulty with that. I think what you want, and there are different ways to do this. We can also have an independent body that makes decisions such as, similar to what the offshore boards and the NEB and so on do. But I'm completely comfortable with the idea of having a political decision made as long as we have the proper kind of connection between the assessment process, the conclusions and recommendations, and the determination made. And so we're transparent about what the outcome is of the assessment and how that relates to the political decision that is being made.
Obviously, this bill continues to keep the final decision, which is a political one, at the cabinet level, ministerial decision. Do you believe there's an opportunity perhaps to move at least a preliminary political decision further forward in the process so that project applicants wouldn't have to expend a lot of money before being told, I'm sorry, but politically we can't support this project?
Well, I think the opportunity to say no is there. Would it be helpful to develop some criteria around how to apply that? I would go back to my original comments. I think whenever there is discretion, it's useful to provide direction about how that discretion is to be exercised. But I think we have to be more careful about the idea of saying yes without going through the process.
Okay,
right?
thank
I think
you.
it's fair to say, the political support to approve this project isn't there. But I think we need the information to determine whether it's a good project. And to get the information, we need to go through the process.
So you're done? Okay. Mr. Amos?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A quick question to Mr. Carleton, whose colleague Ray Orb has worked for many, many years on rural municipal issues in Saskatchewan and nationally. I have a great deal of respect for the leadership he's brought. And I know that small municipalities have complained in the past around the sheer burden of permit seeking, and that drove some of the reform made by the previous administration. However, I'd just like to get your sense of what is the appropriate approach to defining these middle ground classes of works between minor and major works in the context of navigable waters. Because the context is a bit different than in impact assessment. In the context of navigation, we're dealing solely with federal regulatory power. There's no overlap here. So if a project is subject to a different degree of scrutiny, that's, there's not going to be some backup. So I'm interested to hear, what's the, do you have a set of criteria that you think would be best used?
Sure. Be happy to take that. The short answer is no, we haven't developed a set of criteria. But in making the recommendation to review the minor works order, I think that's exactly what we intend to do, and to look. It's really. It's not for Brock and I to say. It's the engineers and the lawyers who are building and approving these projects, who really can provide some better advice on what would be appropriate to include under the minor works order. And just to emphasize, I think, and to tie into your earlier comments around why we think that's important is because, previous to 2009, 2012, you had many water bodies that were on the schedule. Of course, that was reduced, and now there's a new process to add waters to the schedule, and that's there, and we support that. But now you have the application of the Act to all other navigable waters, right? So it's a great expansion of the Act. Works and undertakings on those waters don't have to receive the same authorization. We support that, but now there's a new process of notification, public consultation, a resolution, a dispute mechanism that the minister is responsible for. That's a brand new process, and it's going to take time for all of us, I think, consistent with the comments that Mr. Fisher made, for the public to understand what that process is, for municipalities and other proponents to understand what that process is. And so I think our three recommendations around the Navigation Protection Act are really to say, let's pause here and recognize this broader application of the Act, have the experts, the engineers, et cetera, municipalities to be able to say, there are some other types of works and activities that really would be more appropriately placed on the minor works order in this context for non-scheduled water bodies. And then to ensure that the process, as Mr. Fisher was saying, for notifying the public is as clear as possible to follow and doesn't create new administrative burdens or complexities especially for smaller communities. And then finally, that the timeline that's in place for that public consultation period and for the dispute resolution process is adhered to and reviewed in the future if it's not appropriate.
I understand. I appreciate that response, and I do hope that that FCM will be able to bring advice to the government on how best also to engage in cumulative effects study and also on managing flows, because these are all issues. I appreciate that sometimes it's the delays around permitting that frustrate municipalities, but I think municipalities also have a strong interest in ensuring that they're not affected by reduction in flows from projects. So it kind of goes both ways. Municipalities have an interest in this being done well, and water flows being protected. I'd like to direct my last question towards Mr. Dwell to expand upon the issue of a specialized tribunal. You've gone in some directions here on what kind of criteria, what kind of decisions they could be involved in. I wonder if you'd have advice on what kind of simple enabling provision might best be framed for legislation of the sort. Perhaps it can get developed later on in a regulation. But what kind of core aspects would you think would need to be brought into legislation so that concept could be more fully consulted upon? And if you want to submit in writing after, I'd be very interested to hear yours or any other of our witnesses' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess short answer, I'd be happy to provide some thoughts on that in writing if you'd like. I don't think you need a whole lot in the Act. I mean, I recognize that it's late in the game here to provide detail, but you do want to establish it in the Act, and I think you want to be clear in the legislation what decisions are subject to the oversight from this tribunal. If you can then provide clarity around who can appeal, that would be wonderful. And I think a lot of the rest you can probably set out in regulation. But I'm happy to give that some further thought and make a submission on that.
I'll give my last minute to Ms. May.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Amos. In your list of discretionary pieces that you found through the Act, I think there are examples. Have you ever seen subjective question, have you ever seen an Act with this much discretion without guidance from a minister?
In my experience in environmental law, there's been long been a tendency to be very empowering and discretionary. So when I look, for example, the Nova Scotia Environment Act, it's largely enabling legislation. I think part of the challenge is the early environmental laws we had to be enabling. My basic point is that we have 25 years of experience. It's time to direct that discretion better.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our panelists. We know you have busy lives, and we appreciate the time that you've taken to come and share your testimony. And as you can see, we were very focused on what you had to say, and there were good questions that delved down into some of it. I just wanted to remind the committee before we end the meeting that we have the commissioner coming in on Tuesday. She'll be presenting for an hour, and then the second hour will be the departments. And so if you have any suggestions on who you want to, I want to make sure that people have on those panels who they want. So if you have some suggestions, please let the clerk and I know who that would be. On her report. It's focused on her report on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, we have the minister. She'll be here for an hour, and then we will have the departments also for an hour after for continued questioning. So again, if there's somebody particular that you want, you need to let the clerk and I know. All right, the deadline for amendments, as has been said several times, is April the 30th. As you know, we as committee members can also bring amendments on the floor as we go through clause by clause. So I'm just about to end the meeting. Is there anything else? All right. Thank you.